This is the first video of two parts where we are going to design a user interface. In this video, we're just going to talk about the design pattern that we're going to use, which is Model View Controller. In the next video, we'll actually create the user interface hands-on. So first of all, we'll talk about what is Model View Controller. We'll talk about some definitions and then some examples. After that, we'll define the problem that they are attempting to solve, how they solve the problem, and any other consequences. So with Model View Controller, the problem that we are trying to solve is one of decoupling. And that is, when we present something to a user, we need to consider the presentation that we're giving to the user, and that's one concept. We need to think about the data that we're showing to the user, and that's another concept. And then we need to think about how the user is going to interact with our software, and that's yet another concept. So these go by the different words: model, which describes the data; view, which is the look and feel; and then the controller, which is handling events, button clicks, refreshes, and things like that. So in Model View Controller, we split these concepts into three different compartments, and typically we will design our program so that the model, the view, and the controller are spread across different classes, or in other words, different programming concepts. So the consequence here is that it is easier to apply different views to the same data. Maybe sometime we're going to show it in a tabular data form like an Excel spreadsheet. Other times we'll show it in a graph. Maybe we'll show it in a pie chart. But if we go beyond that, we can also think of different form factors that the presentation will have. Maybe we'll have one form factor, which is a browser window, another one which is a mobile device, and who knows what else, where clients, rich clients that you'll see on a desktop PC or a Mac or something like that. So many different ways we can display data. Now, on the other hand, we also have to consider that it does complicate our program a little bit because it's adding another layer of abstraction, and essentially it's adding more classes that we have to manage. So definitions, the model. Model, we can think of nouns, we can think of data, we can think of DTOs. So plants, people, cars. These are all things that could be part of a model. The view might be web, might be mobile, maybe desktop, but let's even go beyond that and think about a feed of data that we integrate on another device. So we might have a true enterprise application that we can interact with over the web, but perhaps that enterprise application also exposes its information via an XML web service or perhaps a JSON service. In those cases, we can think of that JSON and that XML is a different interface that we're using to interact with the model. And then the controller is typically a class, maybe a Java class or a C# class or something like that, with methods or functions that know how to handle the different events that are likely to come through from the user as the user's interacting with our view. So model, view, and controller. Some tech examples. If you've ever used an Android device or you've ever written anything in Android, there's a good chance that you're using a Model View Controller activity, or organization rather. So this on the right side is a live screen capture of an app that I have in the Play Store, which is called Plant Places Mobile. And if you take a look at this, the widgets that you see on the screen are arranged in an XML file, or in other words, an XML view. I have a sample of that down on the left side of this PowerPoint presentation. But now when you interact with this view, if you click any of these buttons, or if you type and you press enter, then it needs to go to a controller that knows how to handle those button clicks. And sure enough, in Android, that's called an activity class, which is typically a Java class or a Kotlin class that has event handlers like this onClick event that we see down here. So very common look and feel that we have even within one metaphor like Android programming. C# has a similar concept. They have the ASPX page and then also a code behind. So the ASPX would be the view, the code behind would be the controller. Java, Model View Controller has been baked into Java for a very long time. In other words, if we design this program well, we'll be adaptable for the future when there are different ways we can interact with our program. Now, the framework that we're going to use in this video course is Spring Web MVC, which is what we'll look at in our next presentation where we take a look at an example. So in Spring, We are going to have a model, which is just going to be a standard data transfer object or plain old Java object, a simple noun type class. If you've programmed Java before, probably the first class you ever wrote after doing a public static void main was some kind of noun class like this. So we can use annotations to configure this model. The view, good news if you're familiar with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and all those familiar web technologies, that will be our view. We're going to use an add-in called TimeLeaf that's going to handle injecting values into that view from our Java program. So TimeLeaf will handle that coordination. Then we have the controller. A few annotations I'll point out for a controller in Spring. First is the @controller annotation, which just says, this is a controller class. Aside from that, it's pretty much a plain old Java object, nothing really special. Above a method, you can have an @requestMapping annotation, and what that says is, how do we map the URL to this class? In other words, or to the method even more specifically. In other words, if I have plantplaces.com, that might be a URL. But if I have plantplaces.com/evergreens, maybe I want to direct the user to a different page, and that /evergreens is a way to do that, along with this @requestMapping annotation. We'll see this in a hands-on example in our next presentation. Finally, we have @requestParam. That gives us access to the URL name-value pairs that we'll often see when we access a website. So if you fill out a form and you hit submit, that might be a search form that gives you results. Your search criteria will often be available in a set of name-value pairs, and we can introduce those into a method by using the @requestParam annotation. Again, we'll see that in our next video. So as I've been talking, you've probably been thinking some real-life examples, and I can give you a few that come to mind very quickly. First of all, we have here a picture of my hometown airport. This is CVG in Cincinnati, and this is the ticketing counter right out in the front. And I always think that's a really good example of having different views that are using the same model, especially if you've flown for a long time. You kind of remember what flying was like in the 90s and what flying was like today. In the 90s, you'd sit in the lounge and you would note that your flight got canceled or your flight got delayed. Then you go into a long line of people who are on your flight. You go to a gate agent or a ticketing agent and try to get rebooked on a different aircraft or a different flight. Nowadays, it's a little bit different. Nowadays, a lot of times if I'm in the airport and my flight's canceled, I find out about it because my phone tells me so. Maybe my airline's application tells me, or maybe I get a text message. Then, usually, a good airline app will say, okay, your flight's been canceled. We found this alternate itinerary. Would you like to use this? And then you say, yes, I would. And 90% of the time for me, that works great for me. Occasionally, I might want to work out something specific where I need a gate agent or a ticketing agent's help. So then I'll go up to the gate or ticketing agent and say, hey, look, this has me connecting through JFK, but boy, I'd rather connect through Atlanta or something like that. Hey, are there any options here for connecting through Atlanta? Or can you put me in a better seat? This is the seat I was given, something like that. What I've found is that many times the information I have on my phone is as up to date or even more up to date than what the ticketing or gate agent has. But it's actually, even when I say maybe a bit more up to date, it's pretty darn close. In other words, the gate agent, the ticketing agent, is looking at the same information that I'm looking at on my phone. But the gate agent is using a traditional PC where I'm using my phone. And sometimes I'll say, well, it looks like seat 23A is available. Can you give me that one? So we're both interacting with the same software, but with different views. Then you also have, as soon as you bring your bags in, as soon as you get to the airport, you have the kiosks that you can use for self-service check-in. You could also do things on a website. Maybe you check in the night before and pick a seat. All of these things are different views that you can use to interact with the same model or the same data. So, very good example of that because there's so many different ways that you can interact with your airplane reservation. Another type of online reservation is when you get your haircut. A lot of places, especially the chain haircut places, will allow you to reserve a place in line from home using a web browser or using their mobile app, or you just show up at the hair salon and they have a self-service kiosk there. Once again, each of these different views using the same data under the covers, but completely different hardware, completely different form factor. And finally, one a lot of us are familiar with, which is email. So web, mobile, and then a traditional fat client or smart client like Outlook. These are all different ways we can interact with the same model. That model is our email. In other words, our email is the data. So those are good examples of Model View Controller. In our next video, we'll roll up our sleeves and we'll create a very simple user interface using at least View and Controller. Model, we'll add more to that later, but we're going to start the structure where we can support this Model View Controller layout. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.